which today we would call as meditation. So yoga was being used as an act of sustained attention. Yoga Shiva Vitri Nirodha. But there are also very early texts, particularly from the Taoist tradition, the Zhuangzi, which started being compiled from the 3rd century before Common Era. And it does already record techniques, particularly involving the breath, which have to do with the focused, sustained attention. So there are common characteristics across these various meditation traditions, and I'll tell you a bit more about this variety in some minutes. But some of these commonalities that it is an act of sustained attention or concentration with the aim of moving away from your usual flux of thoughts, feelings, and sensations. The other common point is that these techniques try to reach an unusual or transformed state of consciousness. The other thing is that they usually involve a static bodily posture, such as sitting, kneeling, or standing in a particular way. So my second point is really to focus very, very briefly on the varieties of these meditation techniques. I have designed this with a Canadian illustrator for our Oxford Handbook of Meditation. Just see. Yeah. So just to give you a very brief idea, so you have, on the one hand, the religious techniques of meditation. So at the bottom, we have some of the oldest ones, such as the Hindu and the Jewish ones. And at the very top, we have what I have called the therapeutic techniques. This involves things like mindfulness-based interventions, but it also involves transcendental meditation, which is the first large science of meditation movement we have in the 20th century. But before that, we have also things like progressive muscular relaxation, Jacobson's technique, which was already developed in the 1920s and 30s with the purpose of transforming lots of religious ideas of how to effect some bodily changes through sustained attention to muscles. It already secularized quite a bit. So there is a long history throughout the 20th century of trying to secularize and making these religious techniques into therapeutic techniques. Just to mention very briefly on the almost top left side that I have also included purposefully some Islamic techniques from a particular Islamic tradition, such as dhikr, murakaba. So dhikr has to do with recitation of names of God. Murakaba is more similar to meditation in the sense that it does involve more focused and static postures. And Sama has to do with using sacred music for meditation purposes, which you also find across most religious traditions. So what were these meditation techniques developed for and by whom? And here we have a wide variety of meditation goals. So within the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, there's a clear goal of liberating oneself from the cycle of death and rebirth. Within the Abrahamic traditions, from Judaism, Islam to Christianity, we have an attempt to become closer to the divine, to God, to save one's soul. Within, again, Eastern traditions, such as Taoism, there's an aim of achieving a sort of special balance or harmony, or even within Taoism, the development of physical immortality. Now, most often, these techniques were developed by women and men who broke away from society and either lived in very small communities or as hermits. But as I said earlier, even these, what we call these hermit individuals, did socialize with each other. So very seldom they were absolutely individualized techniques as they tend to be seen today. And as I said earlier, most of the times, the aim of these techniques was really to provoke or stimulate a change in the self that allowed the person to move beyond usual ordinary self-concerns or worldly concerns and move closer to God or to a deity or to self-transformation. Probably the earliest record we find of some of these individuals that move away comes from the Rig Veda. And I mean, they're very picturesque, very colorful depictions of how different these people were, in the sense they had very long hair, they were very poorly dressed, but they were able to do something which ordinary humans were not. Just to give it another example from the early Christian tradition, you don't have manuals. That's something which was only developed in the 20th century. Although you do find some exceptions, I'll mention one later in the 19th century. But you already have very clear depictions of techniques of meditation, such as Evagrius techniques of inner vigilance, watchfulness, which is very similar to its scope to contemporary mindfulness, in the sense that you have to pay attention to all your states of mind, both thoughts and feelings and sensations. And the aim of this technique is to fight passions and logismos, which are thoughts inserted by demons, which particularly, these demons particularly like to attack those who are practicing these meditation techniques, because they are the ones who are closer to God. So you have a vast array of techniques going back to 2000 years ago, from fasting, sleep deprivation, physical isolation from larger groups of other human beings. There is this attention to thoughts. There's a recitation of sacred texts, such as the Psalms. There's chanting, and recitation, continuous recitation of short prayers, such as the Jesus prayer in the Christian Orthodox tradition. Now, a question which is central for your summer school, but one which has been discussed for a while, is how effective are these mindfulness and meditation techniques in changing our minds and our bodies? So there's examples of some reflection on this. I mean, here is a well-known one from a Christian mystical text, The Cloud of Unknowing, from the 14th century, where it's very clearly written that the work of meditation, contemplation in this case, will have a favorable effect on the body as well as the soul of anyone who practices it, and will make him or her agreeable to everyone, man or woman, who sees him. So here we have already a very clear report that if you practice these meditation techniques, they will have an effect on your body, but also on your soul, so that even other people will be able to see the effects this will have. There are, of course, earlier reports on these changes from the Taoist text I've already mentioned. Well, so one of the earliest accounts of meditation techniques, the Zhuangji. And here they're referring to the use of breathing techniques and attention to breathing as a possibility of enhancing your health and your longevity. Longevity is a major focus of Taoist techniques. Now, at the same time that they mention the use of these Taoist meditation techniques to prolong longevity and make one's physiology work better, there's already a criticism of the use of these techniques for these purposes. For example, here, they are criticizing the people who are using meditation techniques to enhance one's longevity and one's physiological states. So here we already have, think that this is older than 2000 years, we already have a tension between the use of these techniques to enhance one's physical aspect or one's mental health as today, and its religious aim, which within the Taoist tradition, it is to reach serenity, indifference, stillness and silence, emptiness, nothingness, and non-action. And this tension between the aim of the religious techniques versus the secular techniques is something which is still, perhaps more than ever, very present today. Now, to give you a very brief history of the science of meditation. Starting back in the 1920s and 30s, we start seeing some anecdotal studies of things like yoga, so the use of physical postures to change your physical or mental state of mind. By the 1950s and 60s, you start seeing some studies of meditation experts, particularly within the Hindu tradition. So in 1961, there is this paper in which they use the cold presser task, where you put your hand in icy water, They were also using EEG. And they had these religious experts, these sadhus, so people who have left the normal world to dedicate themselves to religious purposes. So they had 4 yogis doing this exercise. Only 2 of them were able to sustain their hands in icy cold water for over 40 minutes, which, if you have done this, it's just, I mean, practically impossible. Most people can't take this for more than 4 or 5 minutes. It becomes very painful. So not only they were able to sustain this painful exercise, but the EEG records did not change from before to during the exercise, which means that through these meditation techniques, they were able to disengage, to detach themselves from the physical sensation of pain. And you have, I mean, anecdotal reports of this within Eastern traditions elsewhere. So in 1970, the landscape of the science of meditation changes drastically when transcendental meditation starts investing actively in the study of the effects of meditation. So they have a whole vastness, I mean, a whole array of studies on both the physiological, the mental health effects, even up to how it can change levels of intelligence or personality structure. And these early papers were being published in top journals. This is one from the American Journal of Physiology. The first one was published in Science. And to come to more recent times, focusing now on mindfulness in particular, we now have a variety of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. The most rigorous one is this one from 2014, which was published in a top medical journal. And behind it, there is a very large report, which has over 100 pages on the state of the art. And it's not only a very rigorous meta-analysis and systematic review, but it gives you a very nuanced perspective on the effects of mindfulness, both on physiological and mental health outcomes. So we find, on the one hand, the moderate evidence that it works to improve anxiety, depression, and pain. On the other hand, there is low evidence that it does anything on stress and mental health related quality of life. On the other hand, they didn't find any evidence, so there is no effect or insufficient evidence of any effect on things like positive mood, attention, substance use, eating habits, sleep, and weight. And lastly, and this is an important point, so that we have a clear view of the effects of these mindfulness programs when compared to other interventions, that these programs were no better than any other active treatments. And this includes active treatments such as physical exercise, the use of other pharmacological substances, or behavioral therapies. So we now have scientific articles which aim at a wide possibility of effects, from mental and physical health effects up to cognitive, pro-social effects, such as increases in compassion and empathy, or even what we might call quasi or spiritual experiences, such as experiencing pure awareness. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but for example, my lab some years ago did a meta-analysis on the pro-social effects of meditation, particularly mindfulness interventions. And you can find this, it's open access. It's called The Limited Pro-Social Effects of Meditation. But I'd like just to touch upon a couple of things related particular to the neuroscience of meditation. So there has been at some point a big hype around the media that, oh yes, doing mindfulness will change the size of your amygdala, which means it will reduce your fearful reactions. So that's all very anecdotal, actually. There is no strong evidence that it will do something particular to your amygdala. The most recent meta-analysis show, however, that depending on the technique, on the meditation technique you're using, so from open monitoring, which would be mindfulness, to loving kindness, compassion, or focused attention, that these different techniques will have very different correlates, brain correlates, which means that they will be using different areas of brain activation or deactivation, depending on the technique. So if you're focusing your attention on a particular word or a particular image, this will be very different from focusing your attention on very strong positive feelings, such as compassion. The exception to these has to do with down here. There seem to be similar levels of activation for the mid, the anterior insula. And what does the insula usually is associated with? It has to do with states of proprioception. So being aware of internal states, such as being aware of your breath, and less commonly being aware of your heart rate. And this makes perfect sense because generally all of these meditation techniques start by asking you to pay attention to how you are sitting and to your breath. So it makes perfect sense that there is this commonality in terms of brain activation. Now, something else which has been talked about in the media a lot is the use of mindfulness to help children. And this has to do, I'm not sure how it is in Indonesia, but these days, particularly in the US and the United Kingdom, in the United Kingdom, for example, when children are about 16 years old, they have to sit through practically 2 months of daily exams. So teenagers get very stressed, and mindfulness researchers have been looking at the possibilities of using these adapted exercise with very young children. So some of these exercises have been used with 5, 6, 7-year-olds. Here is a YouTube clip, which I won't show you now, but I mean, go ahead and have a look at it. If you just Google thought bubbles mindfulness, you'll see this. It's very well done, but it portrays the mind in a very particular, and I would say as a psychological scientist, in a very wrong way about how your thoughts are formed and how you should deal with them. So one of my concerns is that some of these mindfulness for children programs are actually conveying a wrong idea of how our minds work. But I'd like to say something much more concrete. Some years ago, the Wellcome Trust sponsored the most expensive ever study on mindfulness for children in particular. So they gave over £6 million to study over 8,000 children, which were tested across 84 schools. And this extraordinarily, complex and expensive study was a major flop, was a major failure. The results show that mindfulness not only failed to improve the mental health of children compared to the group control, it might even have had the detrimental effect of those who are at risk of mental health problems. And I mean here, not to self-congratulate myself, but back in 2005, and then in the second edition of our book, the Buddha Pill, in 2019, in the preface, we had already written about the potential risks of giving mindfulness techniques to children within classrooms. And we had even published a case, a very brief anecdotal example of someone that my colleague had seen as a clinical psychologist, a 14-year-old girl who actually experienced some of these detrimental effects while doing mindfulness in school in England. And this takes me to another important and very neglected topic, the idea that meditation and mindfulness in particular might also have negative or adverse effects. So, and this can be seen in different ways. So some years ago, there has been, someone coined the term mindfulness because of these Buddhist-based techniques being used in a secularized way. And the idea that, and this was being taken over by um, by what you call by Silicon Valley, for example, in which they were using meditation techniques to make their employees more efficient, more productive, meaning that they were just using these techniques to make them work harder, when the purpose of these techniques was very different. But there's also other historical examples of an abuse of these meditation techniques, such as by the Japanese military during World War II, where they were using Buddhist meditation techniques and ideas to depersonalize the soldiers so that they would more easily commit suicide in their military efforts. But going back to the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association already back then, and there was already, as I said earlier, a clear interest in the use of meditation for mental health and physical purposes with transcendental meditation. So back in 1977, the American Psychiatric Association published a statement where it said that the association strongly recommends that research should be undertaken in the form of well-controlled studies to evaluate, listen to this, the possible specific usefulness, indications, contraindications, and dangers of meditation techniques. And what's very rarely told and mostly ignored, and I have learned this while working with historians of meditation, is that there is a long history also to reports of potential negative effects of meditation that go back within the Eastern tradition to the 5th century. So the first report comes from the Dharmatra meditation scripture, which reports things similar to what we would now call depression or even acute psychosis when doing meditation in particular ways. And you find similar reports and problematizations across traditions, including Christianity and Islam. So a few years ago, we did a systematic review of the literature going back to 1970. So this was between 1970 and 2020. And we actually found that there was a total prevalence of about 8% of adverse events across 55 studies. So the first one was in 1977 that we found. And these varied quite widely. So the most often problems have to do with reports of increase in anxiety and depression, but you also have reports of pain, fear and terror, dissociation or depersonalization, the re-experience of traumatic events. And this happens across the whole variety of meditation techniques, from transcendental meditation and mindfulness to other things. So I would like to make a point that probably the mind model that is being used by quite a lot of my mindfulness colleagues, which I call the gym mind of the model, is probably wrong. So they're saying usually, and you find this, I mean, being said by people like the current director of the Oxford Mindfulness Center, that just as brushing your teeth or going for a run are well-known ways of protecting general physical health, mindfulness exercises develop mental fitness and resilience. They might, under certain circumstances, indeed help with mental fitness and resilience. These are more political than psychological terms, things like resilience. However, this does not provide an accurate model of our mind's work in general, and more specifically, when you're using techniques which aim is to enter non-ordinary states of consciousness. So I think it's somewhat irresponsible to be portraying the mind and the use of these techniques in such a simplistic way. Finally, so I have mentioned earlier the tension between the religious aims of these techniques and its secular uses today. I'd like to mention something that we're currently doing. So a few years ago, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, more exactly, I was contacted by the Templeton World Charity Foundation because they were interested in organizing a new program of grants on spiritual exercises. in which their aim was to move away from secularized techniques like mindfulness and actually look at the effects of religious techniques within their original scope, which means let's not get hold of a religious technique like Islamic dhikr and secularize it and see its effects. No, let's look at its effects within its religious context and purpose. So the second program, they're now already running the second program, and the study that I'm about, to share briefly, is a grant from their first program, in which we're looking at the potential effects of heart-centered meditation. And one of the things we're doing for this is develop a meditation app, both for Muslims and Christians. So we have, within the same app, we have two different interventions, 8-week series of meditations. And just to give you very, very brief context, the heart is an organ which has a particular role in the Western imagination, which goes way beyond the Hollywood kind of sweet idea of finding true love, or the role of the heart in effect. More than that, for example, in the Old Testament, it's very clear that the heart is being looked at as an organ which is not just there to process a fact, but to process knowledge of God. And you also find this in the Quran, where the heart has is understood within encompassing both emotional, intellectual, and spiritual faculties. And of course, both within Christianity and Islam, there is a tradition of heart-centered practices of meditation, or focused on. These are just examples, but one of these techniques taken from the 9th century in Christianity uses both a focus on the breath, which then moves into the heart, and your attention is supposed to stay within the breath, within the heart, to lead into a clear understanding of God. And within Islam, in what is now modern Pakistan, there is this very detailed manual of it's called The Brilliance of the Hearts, the title, in which you have this very detailed contemplation or meditation of how you should use your attention in relation to both your breath, of recitation of the name of God, and imagining your heart overflowing the passion of love. So the coming together of both breath, recitation, and effect, which is very, very complex and very difficult to do. So certainly not the kind of thing that someone who has never done meditation should try out. So we're, just to finish off, so we're using various instruments to assess this. We're looking both at the physiology, cognitive mental health, and interpersonal levels. And then we'll be looking at particular mechanisms that might be driving these positive changes. So we're currently conducting the pilot for this, both with Christians and Muslims in England. And then we're moving, the major trial is being done in South India and in Hong Kong, because my PhD student is originally from Hong Kong. And this is just a kind of to give an idea of the basic structure, in which we're doing basically a stratified 3-arm randomized controlled trial. Because it's a stratified RCT, because obviously you can't have a pure randomly allocation, so that you don't want the Christians ending up doing the Islamic meditation, or the Muslims doing the Christian. We're using I forgot to say, we're using as control groups both a passive control group and the mindfulness, the usual MBSR intervention of 8 weeks. If you're interested you can find on my website quite a lot of my papers. Most of them are open access. There's also quite a lot of popular science engagement. I've written for New Scientist, the BBC, and there's also quite a lot of podcast interviews. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much for your enlightening session, Mr. Miguel Farias. Okay, so I think the participants are very interesting in our discussion today. So before we start the discussion, I will read some of the rules that maybe the participant should allow. So everyone is feel free to raise your hand and ask your question you may have about mindfulness practice. Then to ensure that we have a productive and informative session, kindly keep your question concise and focused. So without any further ado, let's open the floor to your question, Mr. Miguel Farias. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will pick you up and then let you to open your mic.
Yes, thank you. So I see various questions in the chat. Would you like me to
Yes.
just
Yes.
pick them? Okay. Yeah.
Actually, I want to ask you, you want to answer the question by one by one, or just
So
okay.
if people just send their question, but I'd also be happy if people want to ask
Okay.
them orally. It's fine, but I can start with the ones. So there's a couple of questions
Yes.
on the chat. One is, can meditation
So
providing?
yes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Do you want to read them out or shall I read them out? Yeah, please go ahead.
Maybe okay. Thank you, Mr. So the first question is from Nurtilek Kardirov from University of Semarang. So she asks you about the first question is, can meditation provide insight into the nature of reality or the true nature of existence?
So the first question, the true nature of existence, I just have to give the context. This is usually framed within a more Eastern context when we talk about the true nature of reality. And within these traditions, yes. So the purpose, say, of certain Hindu techniques is precisely to provide a true nature into existence and into the self. I forgot to say that one other commonality across these world religious traditions is that there is a very particular interest on the self. I mean, who am I, human? How do I relate to God or to ultimate existence? And how can I transform my ordinary self into something different? So yes, you're absolutely right. These techniques within that context is indeed to provide an insight into the nature of existence and into the nature of who you truly are as a human being. And I would absolutely agree with the second question that different meditation techniques may lead to different altered states of consciousness. And this will also be mediated by the individual in terms of personality, for example, and the context in which he's living right now. Think, for example, that the early meditation literature from the 1970s, the science of meditation, it was very explicit that clinical psychologists interested in meditation would tell their patients that if you are currently depressed, you should not do meditation, because they had already figured out, I mean, somewhat in terms of common sense, that if you're experiencing a low mood, meditation, doing something very static and focused, may not be the right thing for you. So that's what I meant by interaction with not just personality, but with your current state of mind.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Miguel.
Yeah, I think the second question, we don't need to read it out. It has to do with the results of that very large study on the use of mindfulness with school children. I think this is really a very, very good example of how we should not do science, actually. It's wonderful getting all this amount of of many. But there should have been a more carefully conducted pilot. They did do a pilot, but obviously it wasn't a well-done pilot, because when the media reports came out, they tried to defend themselves by saying that, oh, actually, about 80% of the children found the exercises very boring, and that's why they didn't really do them properly. I mean, you don't really need £6 million to find that out. I mean, that's almost ridiculous that came up with that line of excuse. So I think we have to be more humble. There's also a lack of humility, because this became so big so quickly and so hyped by some media. We should not forget that there's the importance of intellectual humility. And finally, the last question I have here is how to integrate mindfulness into everyday life, including work and social relationships, and how to measure progress in their mindfulness practice, evaluate its effectiveness. So this really depends on the context. Say, if you're doing this to deal with anxiety within a clinical context, I mean, ideally, you would have a clinical psychologist or a psychotherapist who would help you monitor this. I think I started out by being a psychotherapist. I was trained as a cognitive behavior therapist. And something which we learn very quickly is that we are terrible judges of ourselves. And that's the reason why we need psychotherapists, right?
Yes.
If we don't have a mirror or a camera in front of ourselves, we can't see our own reflection. And that also works psychologically. We're terrible, terrible judges of ourselves. And this is the reason also why within these religious traditions, when you want to do these meditation techniques, practices seriously, you do have someone, you do have a mentor, or within the Christian tradition, you call it a spiritual director. Within other traditions, but you have someone who is more experienced, giving you some clear guidelines on what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. So within a clinical psychology context, I mean, such progresses, particularly if you're dealing with mental health problems, should be evaluated and kept track by your therapist or clinical psychologist.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Miguel, for the enlightening answer. For any other participant who have the question, please raise your hand, or if you're shy or maybe not confident to say it, please write it down in the chatting room. Okay, we waiting. Okay, there's someone who's raising. Okay. Yes, maybe the operator can spotlight her. Okay, hello, you. Okay, you can open your mic and then tell the question forward to Mr. Miguel.
Is it my turn? Can I ask?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah,
Yes,
go ahead,
of
please.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. And my question is actually, you talked that when somebody is actually feeling no, then it's not really recommended for them to engage in any mental exercise reaching their highlighted spiritual awareness. So my question is exactly, does that mean meditation should actually be more into our daily routine? And if that's so, should it be more should it be one type, or should it be more than one type? Because I have the example of what you mentioned about Islam, which is what we specifically call sujood, the acts of being on the floor and putting our heads on the floor, facing that direction you mentioned before. So if that's so, then again, is it only one way, or should it be more than one way? Meditation, sorry.
Yeah. So thank you for that. That's a very good question, actually, to frame the larger literature on religion and health. So there's now a very large literature, I mean, possibly as large as the meditation mindfulness one, which is looking at the effects of religious belief and religious practices, both on physiological and mental health outcomes. And most of the studies were only correlational, cross-sectional, but there's now longitudinal studies which allow you to, I mean, to say with a much greater degree of accuracy, what actually happens and what makes an effect. So it's very, very clear that religious practice, much more than belief, has a reliable, clear effect on both physiological and mental health indicators. So in that sense, doing I mean, within an Islamic context of doing the usual prayers, prostrations to God, to Allah, would have a positive impact, generally speaking.
Okay, and one more thing, sir.
Why that happens? Why that happens is a different question, and it may be for different reasons. There's a behavioral aspect, there's a social aspect, within the behavioral aspect, most of these practices, when these practices are done in a group, for example, the effect may be stronger, for example.
Okay, and one more thing I just want to say is the main question here was, do we actually need more than one way for meditating or meditation, sorry? Regardless of what example it's going to be, do we only
one
need
way in terms of one technique?
Yeah, one type or one technique. That's the thing.
Sorry, the question is if one person only needs one technique, or it's if all persons only need one technique?
No, if I personally use only one technique, is that all that's going to work? Is that all that is leading to the impact or to the goal?
So, that really depends on the individual and on the stage of their lives. It may be that one technique will work for them at a certain point, and it may not work so well at a different point. Or it may be that if the person is quite a lot of people use a technique, generally speaking. People who are usually more invested in meditation will want to try out different techniques. Or they will want to make one technique deeper or more complex. Say you start with a recitation technique, or you start with a simple focus technique, and then you add something to it. Because if the person is doing it for religious purposes, they will experience different things at different points if they do this regularly. So usually there will be, if the technique is not changed per se, in the sense that you're moving from one technique to another, there will be adaptations or tweaks to the technique. These things are very fluid. They're very, very seldom, used in a static way.
Okay.
It's almost like it's almost like the use of a musical instrument within a tradition. These are usually passed orally, right? And when you find, excellent musicians, they will all have their own particular style of playing.
Okay, that's a really great example. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so
Thank
much.
you for your questions.
Okay, if there are any other questions, we still have a couple of minutes. Okay, I will wait until 53 minutes. Okay, I will wait until 2 minutes. If there's any questions coming up, I will end up the question and answer question.
Yeah. I do have a question. I do have a question
Okay.
for you.
Okay,
Yes.
sir.
Yes. Can you tell me a bit of the context of this summer school? So are you using just the secular models of mindfulness, or are you interested in using a kind of Islamic model of meditation?
Okay, so actually we are here as a nursing international summer course. So we actually learn about mindfulness and we try to spread it out so everyone will know the importance of mindfulness and the practices. And also it helps students to maintain their stress and also their pressure. So actually, we doing the summer course is because in Indonesia lately we have a lot of problems about mental health, and this make us have this action actually.
Okay.
So we actually have a session with some of lecture, and then we have some kind of assignment, and the assignment actually in the end of this session, our committee will ask you about the assignment from this week. So actually, uh, it's like a class meeting, something like that.
Okay. So yeah, and you're using just the usual secular mindfulness MBSR model. Is that right?
Yep. Yes, I
Okay.
have Islamic mindfulness, some kind of meditation after praying.
Okay. It's just because I'm not sure now in the US there's a Muslim association in which I think they call themselves the Tamarkoz Association, in which they say they're using an Islamic exercise. So I actually tried it the other day, and it's very similar to mindfulness in the sense that the aim is really to relax. I'm just going to send it in the chat. The aim is really to stimulate a sense of physical relaxation, like mindfulness.
Yes.
But they
Yes.
say they're coming from an Islamic context. But the exercise was completely stripped of any religious ideas.
Yes, but actually in now in Indonesia, we lack knowing about mindfulness. Just some people knowing that they actually should have a meditation in daily routine. They should actually managing their stress. So that's why we actually do this summer course. Not only because we want to warning people, but we want to helping our friends, not only in Indonesia, but also in
Sure.
international.
And we know that the levels of burnout with nurses are very, very high all over the world. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for the great discussion.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so our time for question and answer has to close. So if you have any further question, please contact our committee for more discussion. So we will great opportunity to exchange idea and build a lasting connection. So, ladies and gentlemen, before we close the meeting today, we would like to invite Mr. Miguel Farias to have a documentation with us. So if you still close your camera, please now you can open the camera and we will take a picture with Mr. Miguel.
Oh, picture.
Yes, for some documentation.
Excellent.
Okay, I will start counting if the operator are ready. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, for the next slide, 1, 2, 3. Okay. There is a next slide or enough? Okay, enough. Thank you, Mr. Miguel,
Thank you so
for
much.
your enlightening
Very
session.
nice.
So
Very nice
now
to talk to you all.
I will share the conclusion about discussion today. So, importance of
Right.
mindfulness practice, particularly in the context of meditation materials. I want to express my deep appreciation for your active participation and thoughtful contribution to both these sessions.
Thank
Today's
you.
insight remind us that mindfulness just fleeting trend. Its fundamental aspect that human experience that can profoundly enhance our quality of life. It's remind that in this fast-paced world, taking the time to cultivate mindfulness is investment to our well-being in the well-being of those around us. As we leave this session, I encourage you to take this teaching to heart, explore mindfulness further, incorporating it into your daily routines, and consider the roles of meditation materials in your journey towards more mindfulness balance. Thank you once again of your participant, and I wish you all a mindful and harmonious journey ahead. Goodbye, and
Thank
we will
you. Take care.
come back
Have a good
soon.
course.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
time, sir.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you for the lecture, Mr. Miguel. Such an interesting topic, right? Hopefully, the knowledge is useful for all of us. We also appreciate Ms. Acha for leading the sessions. Finally, we've come to the end of the first day of International Summer Course 2023. Don't forget, we still have the second day tomorrow. Thank you for your enthusiasm and participation for today. We apologize if there are any words that are not pleasant to you. Good afternoon, everyone. See you tomorrow. I hope you guys have the same spirit, or maybe more spirit than today for tomorrow, the second day of International Summer Course 2023. And information will be shared in the WhatsApp group, so please check your group, everyone. See ya.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank
You so
you.
much. You can leave the meeting.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye po. Thank you,
Hope you
everyone.
enjoy today's event.
Recording stopped.
But I won't let you down.